Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Good to see you. Hopefully we're not the only survivors. So we are attempting to stream this online as well for people who weren't ready to come out just yet. So hopefully we'll still have the recording and so forth there. So we are aiming to resume our normal format. We'll have a talk about 45 minutes or so, and then a short break to refresh your refreshments before we go into a Q&A. So tonight we are delighted to have a talk from Professor Mark Maltby from University of Bournemouth on humans and animals in Roman Winchester and beyond.
Hello, and hello. Actually getting in front of people. It's a really strange experience. We had 2 years at Bournemouth on Zoom. Poor old students have had a rubbish time trying to do, and I hated it. And luckily, I'm going to have to stay here because when I first went back to lecture at Bournemouth, I was like a puppy. I was wandering around, leaping all over the place. So if I start moving around, stop me. Okay. Anyway, hello. That's me. What I want to try and do today is give you an outline of the sort of work I do, and to sort of focus it on a local aspect. I will use Winchester as a sort of like a case study, but I'll be referring to other things. So the idea is to give you some idea of what it was like in terms of humans and animal relationships, if you like, in Roman Winchester and in other parts of Roman Britain. Now, where do we get our evidence from? You may think that we can have quite a lot of evidence coming from written sources. We are dealing with, obviously, a very literate society. And we also have lots of images, such as these on mosaics, which have animals on them. And we also have people who advised, gave treatises on how to farm. This is Columella, 1st century AD, based in Rome, and he gave several volumes to advise farmers the best ways to grow crops and to keep animals and so on. You also may have heard of this guy, Apicius. If you ever go to various Roman displays, and there's a cooking exhibition on, you can guarantee they'll have found an Apicius recipe to test your taste buds of a so-called classic Roman cuisine. The problem is with the historical and documentary literature is that it was designed and written for people who lived in Italy. Was it the same in this goodness forsaken province on the outer edge of the empire, full of people, barbarians, as they called them, who may have had different traditions? If you're actually looking for historical and documentary sources in related to Roman Britain itself and to animals, we are fairly limited in what we can do. There is things like this up on Hadrian's Wall, the fort at Vindolanda. Back in the 1970s, they found the first of some tablets on wood and ink, and we get little gleanings of what some of the military who are stationed there would say. So this is an example, one of the tablets. Of most of these tablets, you only get sort of half the statement, you rarely get the full ones. So bruised beans, 2 modii, that's about 7 litres of dry weight. Chickens, 20, 100 apples if you can find nice ones. 100 or 200 eggs if they are for sale at a fair price. 8 sextari currency of fish sauce, a modius of olives. It comes back to the slave of Verecundus. So we get little gleanings like that in relation to the military in this case and as well. But is that typical? We'll come back to that at the end. But what I'm going to be talking about most today are bones. This is what I deal with. And this is the sort of typical things which we're faced with. So it starts off as fairly basic. What does one do when you get an excavation and you get animal bones? With the help of reference materials, modern reference skeletons, what do we recall? We recall the type of bone, the head or the foot, the species where we can identify them, and then basically anything else which might give us some information from them, such as how old was this animal when it died, the teeth, for example. Is there evidence that it was being butchered in a particular way? Is there evidence that dogs have been gnawing it? Is there any evidence of pathology? How big were they, these animals? What was their stature? Were they large, small, or whatever? And so on. So basically, we have lots of hundreds and sometimes thousands of bones. We start recording them onto various means and then try and summarize the data we're having. So that's the sort of thing we look at. In terms of what I want to do today, I'm going to base most of it around the results we got from the city of Winchester itself. And a lot of the material I'm going to start off with relates to excavations, which, as you can see from the dots on the map there, actually lie mostly on the outskirts and the suburbs of the Roman town. And this was published some years back now, but I'll use that as the basis and add a few other things. So that's Winchester, but I'll also be mentioning other places not that far away from here. For example, at Osselbury, which was a farm, or a complicated farm, which went right the way through from the Iron Age, somewhere from around about 400 BC or so, 500 BC, right the way through the Roman occupation, taking us to around about 400 AD. And it's reasonably close to Winchester, but it's not in the town. And if you drive up past the junction of the A34 and the M3, that's Winnell. The junction, when they installed the motorway, they did excavations along that route, and this is one of the sites at Winnell Down. Again, a site which has started off in the Iron Age, around about 450 BC, and carried on in various stages until about the 2nd century AD. So we have sites beyond Winchester with which we can compare things which will happen just before the Roman invasion, things which happened during Winchester's occupation by the Romans in the late 1st century AD onwards. So what I want to do is just give you a run through of different species and our relationships with them. So I'm going to start off with cattle. It won't come as much of a surprise, I suspect, for you to know that the most important source of meat to the Romans and in Roman Britain was beef. How do we know this? Well, again, a very basic thing we can do is when we get all these bones from our sites, we basically count them. It's a sort of level I start off at. And you can count them and compare, whether you've got lots of one species or other species or how wide a range of species are. This is a very straightforward, rather simplistic way of looking at it. Here we just on this diagram, we're comparing 3 species: cow, pig, and sheep. My students hate these diagrams. They're called tripolars. I don't know if any of you have used them elsewhere. Basically, if you've got 3 things and you get the total, you can work out the percentages of the 3, and you can actually express the relationship between those 3 in a graph like this. So how this one works, just to be quickly through, they're on a different axis. So in the green area are sites. These dots represent different assemblages from Iron Age sites in southern England, which our colleague of mine at Bournemouth, Ellie Hambleton, I looked at some years ago. So when you're at the top of this particular diagram, we've got the dots there. That means those assemblages had lots of cow bones. This is to say, this is the Iron Age, this is pre-Roman. Not that many had loads of pig, but quite a lot had lots of sheep, and you can see that there's sort of in the middle some more combinations. So that's the, if you like, what was happening before the Romans came here. And this is her same sort of graph from the Roman period, looking at a number of sites. And you can see a lot of the dots, a lot more of the dots now focused on the top of that diagram. In other words, during the Roman period, there was an increased emphasis on the reliance of cattle and beef in the meat diet, it would seem. Since Ellie did that sort of work, there's been a huge amount of excavations across the country whereby people have looked at Roman sites. This is a part of some information derived from a large project based at Reading University, where they found all the reports they could find, both published and unpublished, from Roman rural sites, not towns, villas or smaller farmsteads, and all those dots represent different individual sites. You can see these days we have a heck of a lot of sites which date to the Roman period in this case. Many of them, where preservation conditions are good enough, will have animal bones. And what did they find from this? This is work led by Martin Allen, based at Reading at the time. And basically this graph from the left to the right takes us from the start and sort of the late Iron Age, 1st century BC, takes us through to on the right-hand side to the 3rd and 4th century AD, so through the Roman period. And basically they're measuring here the average number of animals represented by these bones. So you can see cattle and sheep are well represented, pig less so, but you can see that blue, the cattle, increase in the later Roman period. The implication of that, they argue, is that cattle became even more important in the later part of the Roman period in Britain. This is one where they did the same sort of things with regional variations. The blue represents the cattle, and there was more cattle found in the area around Hadrian as well in the north of England. Down in this part of the world, over half the cattle were, generally speaking, usually about half the bones they found overall, if you count everything together on all these different sites. Those were just rural sites. In towns, such as Winchester and other large centres, people have done a lot of work on different towns. What are the figures there? The similar sort of figures, these are, again, are average figures. Cattle slightly higher than they are on the rural sites, so it may be that these towns are attracting more interesting getting cattle for their food, and quite a higher than in the countryside, higher level of pig bones turning up on these sites. Generally, that's very general. Where does Winchester fit into with it? In red, you can see it's sort of halfway, league table halfway up, not in danger of relegation. These are all sites I looked at for various times. So about half the bones we got from those sites I showed earlier on from Winchester were cattle, and then a reasonable amount of sheep and pig and so on, just looking at those three species. And you can see on the right hand side is this thing called a NISP, which is the number of individual specimens, basically bone fragments. So that gives you the idea of the sample sizes we're dealing with. Some of them, as you see, reasonably large. But that's not really the whole story. It's just one thing to say, well, yeah, they ate a lot of beef. But when you actually get down into some of the details and look at differences within a town, this is work I did years ago at Exeter, where again, you see lots of those dots on the map represent different parts of the town where they had excavations, and looked at the assemblages. So I was able to compare the bones from different assemblages, and then looked at the type of bones which are found in them. Bottom graph there is a site from the near centre of the town, and those numbers represent different bones of the body. And you can see numbers 1 to 12. There's a reasonably equal amount of bones from different parts, nothing unusual. You get in all parts of the carcasses turning up on these sites. But if you look at that top graph, which is from a disused military ditch on the edge of the town, you can see that that equal distribution is far from true. We have a lows in the numbers 1, 2, and 3, skull, mandibles, and teeth, and a lot down on the other end, metapodia, basically foot. So these is a big dump. Over nearly 3/4 of the bones from this particular deposit were cattle, just the heads and the feet. This is primary butchery. This is the stuff they don't want. They're just chucked away, but in a large amounts. And that starts to get the clue. Large amounts may mean that we are dealing with quite large scale processing of cattle by somebody or some people to create that basically big waste dump. And the more we've looked around Roman towns, we find more of these unusual accumulations of high amounts of cattle with butchery waste. In Gloucestershire, this town of Cirencester, there's several samples from there. All those are over 70% cattle bones there, and some of them have these head and foot distributions. So we do look as though we're coming across in different towns the development of large-scale processing by some people who are living there. Another thing which happens associated with this is changes in the butchery style. This is a bit of a cow thigh bone, and you can I can see these small marks on them. Those are made with a very fine knife. This particular bone comes from that site at Osselbury I showed you, but it's displaying a very typical style of type of butchery, which you find in the earlier Iron Age. They were used, most of the butchery was performed with fine knives. By the time we get to the Roman period, objects like this start to make more of an appearance and become more important. Cleavers. And we only have to start looking at some of the Winchester assemblies to see some of the damage they can create on the bones. Top left is a back of a cow jaw. You can see a mark here, and it's been totally hacked through there. That's the bottom ends of a couple of humerus bones. That's bottom end of a metacarpal, this sort of area. And again, you can see some marks there. And this one here, you can see there's a knife cut on that one. That's, if you recognise, that's at the top of a femur. Why is there a knife cut there? Well, I don't know if you've tried, and I always worry if I've got butchers in the audience. But if you actually try and use a cleaver onto meat, it bounces. So what you have to do first is peel away the meat so that you've got a cleaver able to hit it, and then you can hit the bone through. We had a student at Bournemouth who was an ex-butcher, and we used a lot of experimental archaeology with him, and he was a very useful man to know. Then we get these sort of things. This is, can you see this? This is a mark, and that's also made with quite a heavy blade. This is a little bit of cow femur, and that is a filleting mark, not with a knife, but with a thing. So somebody's gone with this, and I'll show this one as well. This is a tibia also from there. You can see the marks along there. Someone's gone along with the, I don't know if this is going to be visible online, go along and then stripped it with probably the edge of the cleaver. It looks crude. We did the experiments. It's fast. You can do a lot more filleting doing it that way than you would using a knife. That's Winchester. You get the same sort of butchery turning up all over the place in these towns. That's an example here from Cirencester, another thing. You can see what I'm getting here all the way along here. There's the marks made, these little scoops made with that. And these are where it's been reported in the literature. All these major Roman times, they found examples of this sort of butchery turning up in the town. When you don't get out much, like me, you actually start working out the numbers of bones and how common it is. So these are all from the stuff I've done, and you can see in red there the Winchester. About 20% of these upper limb bones, we're talking the humerus, the radius, the femur, and the tibia, the sort of meaty bits of the legs, very consistently being butchered throughout, as they are on some of these other major Roman towns. But they're not doing that in the countryside. Osselbury and Whittledown on there, you don't find that sort of butchery there at all. In other words, the main towns are the ones where those butchers are resident, and we can discuss it later on. I think there's a military origin to some of these butchers. We see them on military sites as well. So we're getting this contrast. Winchester is attracting this sort of work. Another thing we quite find common on the same sort of upper limb bones is that they get split longitudinally, again with a cleaver. You take one there, you go chop. Don't do this at home. It breaks open. You've got marrow available. You can get marrow other ways, but there's an example of a tibia from Winchester. There's an example of a radius splitting exactly the same way from Cirencester. And those are a load of several of them from the Roman town of Caerwent in South Wales. Very typical. And again, if you don't go out a lot, you can do the counting. And you can see Winchester, it's pretty common here as well. But you get other places where it really, really is common. You get certain deposits where people have accumulated all these bones together and processed them all together in large numbers. Huge sample from Gloucester there, you see. 78% of those bones were split in that way, not all of them were. So somebody somewhere wants that marrow from the bones. Now, whether it's to do with getting a large amount of broth, or I think the marrow might have been used for other things, possibly, if we start looking in terms of lighting for oil and that sort of thing, maybe as a possibility. But they're turning up in the towns. You don't find them on the Roman side. Not at all, hardly any. So that's cattle so far. So what ages were these cattle which we brought into Winchester? We can look, rather like we do, we can look at the teeth, look at the wear patterns, look at which you've either got permanent or deciduous teeth across Britain. That is the work from the Reading people again. Going from the left is neonatal through to the elderly. You can see it's a reasonably steady kill-off pattern through time, through the ages, biased towards adults and elderly, so cattle which are 4, 5, 6 years and older, quite common. But you know, you're getting animals of all ages. The top thing there is Winchester. You're not getting them all. They're focusing on cattle of about 4, 5, 6 years of age. Prime beef cattle are being brought in, and a lot of them being butchered by these specialist butchers, butchering things in their particular way. So they're focusing on particular animals and acquiring particular animals. Other things which we can do in archaeology with shows the same sort of results is actually looking at the bottom of pottery and looking for lipid residues, which you can scrape off. And talented people like Andre Colonnesi, based at York, and colleagues do this, and they look at the lipids and look at the evidence from there. And this is from up the road at Silchester for the work they've done there. And basically the type of lipids which are sort of extracted from the bottom. Oh, hello. What happened there?
I don't know. Should we go to the next slide? Or...
Oh, okay.
It's got a blank slide in there, I think.
I might have pressed the wrong button. I'm not going to try the laser again. The middle graph there is the meat of, which could be cattle or sheep, most likely to be cattle. You see the peak there? A lot of these pots have beef stew or bits of beef in them. On the left, dairy products, which again you can have a different lipid signature. Not huge amounts turning up in these pots. Yes, they were no doubt using cattle and the sheep and goats for dairy produce, but it's not showing up. Right hand side, pigs mainly going there. So it sort of reflects a little bit of those figures I got from the animal bones earlier on, turning up on the site like this as well. Other things which have been done recently are looking at the isotopes which you can get from some of these animals. Strontium isotopes, basically this works on the principles of, depending where you live and the geology you are, you ingest food for the food chain, but tiny amounts of that are part related to strontium, and an isotope to strontium, strontium 87 against 86. And depending on the age of the rocks, that amount of strontium will vary. So in some areas you have a slightly higher strontium in your bodies, we all have them, or slightly less coming, and so on. Same with cattle. So the cattle in particular areas, we can use this technique to actually trace through their ages, because if you actually section the teeth in the right way, you can get a bit of enamel which relates to with the cow when it was very young, or a different part of it relates to where it was shortly before it died. So you actually also look at movement of these things. So they've done that at Osselbury, worked at Sheffield by Minetti and colleagues. And what they basically showed there was that in the late Iron Age into the early Roman period, we're starting to see more cattle from non-local areas turning up on a site like husbandry. You can imagine that in Winchester, that was probably even more the case. So basically people are getting a supply line which is going beyond the very local, but actually getting things from a much wider distance. Other things that the Romans did was improve the size of the cattle which were being eaten. Work again from Sheffield looked at this sort of thing. On the top graph there is what it was like in the early Iron Age, or the late Iron Age. And as we go down into the Roman period, you can see things move to the right. That's taking a measurement of this particular bone, the humerus. And you can see by the late Roman period, the cows they were having in Eastern England, these are mostly from Essex, were larger than they were earlier on. And we know from a little bit from genetics these days as well. And I think that some of these may well have been initially imported animals brought in by the Romans and then developed as we went on. That's on the Far East. Does it happen around here? Well, this is Windle Down. I said it was Iron Age into Roman. The top two phases are the Iron Age ones. The bottom one is the Roman ones, early Roman. And you can see there's quite a number of larger cattle have started to appear very early on in the Roman period down here as well. They're getting new types of stock. Sheep. You'll see in a lot of bone reports the mysterious species called sheep goat. That's because we are limited in how we can tell the two apart. The vast majority where we can tell apart in sheep, so I shall call them sheep from now on. In terms of Winchester, on the left-hand side is that graph. So lots of cattle, this is from the number of fragments in the NISP, then sheep, goat, then pig, and bits and pieces of horse and dog. Just as a thing, another way of counting is because you're breaking up cattle into more pieces, you're going to get a bias towards cattle. In terms of one cow skeleton is going to produce more bone fragments than a sheep, yeah, because it's butchering more. So the right-hand side is another way we look at it, the minimum number of individuals based on what we have. And you can see here that switches around. There are actually more sheep probably being eaten within the town than cattle. But then if you go back again and work out that the average meat weight of sheep against cattle, you still have loads more beef because they're so much bigger, basically. But just to sort of demonstrate that. So with sheep, what do? Yeah, we look at the teeth and look at their ages again. And this is Windle Down at the top again. This is looking at the ages. So far left, newborn, far right, senile. Okay, so again, so what we have here, I'm going to try the laser again. Let's see what happens. We get quite a lot on some of these Iron Age sites, quite a lot of animals killed at the end of their first year, the autumn of the first year. Maybe these are animals which are not really needed for breeding or for keeping for wool or the herd. Let's kill them off 6 months to 12 months. Get lots of those. Butchery, that's near Andover, similar bias there. We don't get many in this sort of area. There's about 18 months, 2 years of age, where sheep are at the best size if you're keeping them for meat. They're nearly at full size, and so on. So that's one of the Iron Age patterns. It's more varied than that. This is Winchester, looking at the yellow in particular. What we see, what we've lost from all these sites actually. Well, these first year killings are not there. What they're getting into the town, and indeed at Osselbury to a lesser extent, are animals which are 18 months, 2 years of age, the ones that are the best to kill off from it, and quite a few actually rather older animals. Some of these would be breeding animals, but there's probably a greater interest maybe in keeping sheep for wool. You keep sheep for longer, older sheep, more older sheep if you keep it for wool because you want annual fleeces. So we see then a change taking place there. We also see changes in site, even within a local area. So down the bottom here is Osselbury. This is throughout the late Roman period. These are measurements, what we got here, bottom of the shin, the measurements, there they are down there. This is Winchester. The sheep coming into Winchester tended to be bigger than the sheep just 10 kilometres down the road at Osselbury. Again, is this a marketing or an acquisition aspect? So we can see these local variations. And another thing which we start seeing appearing in the Roman period are sheep without horns. All the Iron Age ones, or nearly all the Iron Age ones I've come across, sheep have horns. We're getting some larger sheep, we know some of these are larger, now without horns. Looks like there's a new type of sheep being brought in. I hesitate to use the word breed because that has other connotations, but certainly newer types. But just to give you a sort of idea that it's not just straightforward here is, let's go and eat these sort of things and not thinking about it. We do get some curious deposits as well. This is from the northern suburb of Winchester, if you know the area just up the road here, at Victoria Road near Hyde Abbey, that sort of site just beyond the walls here. There's a building, you can see an arrow there, dating to the later 3rd century AD. And from a post hole in there, there was a skeleton of a sheep. I've put them together here. They weren't like this, they were in pieces. And what we have is a skeleton of a sheep that's had parts of its skull, which are not illustrated here as well, but they're just articulated bones. It's a hornless ewe, female sheep. It was about 3 years old when it died, but it had an old break in the shin bone here. It's got a charred ankle bone down here. We've got the foot bones below, but it's been charred. And we've got cuts on another ankle bone on this one here. And this is from another skeleton. These are ankle bones again with cut marks on them. We worked it out. We put a sheep on a spit exposed to the fire, the bits which are more likely to be exposed to the fire and get burnt are the bits on the edge, where you've taken the feet off and you've just got the edges of those. But that's fine. So we've got evidence for spit roasting. But then they seem to have been very carefully collected all the bones together and put them, in this case, in a post hole. And it's often found in association with a foundation of a building. So it's a sort of ceremony or a ritual, if you like, that maybe dedicating a building change. You have some sort of celebration, and then the remains go into the thing. And there's certainly of the stuff we looked at, at least 8 examples of that we found in Winchester, and there are more we can find elsewhere. Just going through more briefly some of the other things. Pigs, yes, those are pig bones. Found those in Winchester. There it is in the listings. Just looking at the 3 main species again. 40% pig. Cirencester, Chichester, Winchester, quite low. Look at some of the ones from Exeter and so on, rather higher. That's partly to do with where you dig in the town. You tend to get more pig bones at the centre of towns than on the outskirts. You also try and you get them more often in sites or buildings which have higher status. Pigs may have been, or may have been more of a status food, and it's certainly much more linked to what was happening in Italy and other parts of the central in the Roman Empire. Unless you really want to keep pigs as pets, you kill most of them off, of course, at a fairly young age, under 2 years old. We get some suckling pigs. Also the possibility, and we know this from 1 or 2 evidence from actually is in Leicester, there's some evidence of pig slurry in the Roman town itself. In other words, some pigs might have been kept in towns. In Winchester, that's the size of the pigs. I just mentioned this particular bone here. You can do it in other bones, quite large. Down the road at Osselbury, little pigs. Big pigs, little pigs. The big pigs are bigger in Winchester. Is that because of stein husbandry? Are they getting them from a different source? We don't necessarily know yet, but they're different. Horses, generally rare in Roman towns. Again, if you're on the outskirts of town, you're more likely to find horse bones. But of course, horses are mostly associated with beasts of burden, not as ploughing in this period. You don't have plough horses until the medieval period, but for riding, pulling carts and that sort of thing was certainly there, which doesn't mean to say that sometimes they were also eaten, because we do get butchery marks on some of them, but never as extensively as cattle. And you can see the figures there, have the percentages from those sites. Horses second down the list, not huge numbers. Other things which happened in the thing with our dogs in the Roman period. What we see in the Roman period is a proliferation in the sizes of dogs coming in. We're getting some specialist breeds, particularly little ones, lap dogs. Romans brought a lot of lap dogs into Britain. So these are on the 2 on the far side, a modern greyhound. On the right-hand side is a modern toy poodle. Those are examples from the same site in Lincoln, just give you some idea of the range. We see a lot more interest in these things. In Winchester, this is one pit, had 7 complete dog skeletons in them. Why? Why 7 dogs all in one pit? Is it ritual? Is it because they all died of disease? Is it because they're having population control? Whatever that might be, you can just look at the size of those skulls, you can see quite a difference in them. If you actually study mosaics, you will think, well, yes, hunting was important. It probably was to some of the classes, but in terms of your everyday things, which at least are the bones which are getting back into the towns or some of the other sites, wild animal bones are pretty rare. You get hare, yes, you get red deer, yes, you get roe deer, but in really tiny amounts. Now, it's so possible, of course, that they butchered them off site and only brought some of the meat in, but we certainly don't really see them turning up in anything like large numbers. Fallow deer are a Roman introduction. We find them on 1 or 2 really highly prestigious sites. If you know Fishbourne and the palace there, that was the earliest finds we have of fallow deer. These were animals which were there to show off. They're around there. They disappear in the Saxon period mostly and then reappear in the Norman period. So we get very few sites. There are rumours that we might have 1 or 2 from Roman Winchester. I'm not convinced we've got the right dates for them yet. We'll have a look at that. Fish is a difficulty for animal bone specialists because you do need to dig very carefully, you need to sieve bones, and not everybody has time to do all the sieving. So we don't have the full range of what we have. Generally, what we see are people exploiting the fish in the local areas. So Winchester, Roman period, getting things like eel, and some herrings and some freshwater fish. The fish sources, the garum, have been found in some towns. We haven't actually found that, up to my knowledge, we haven't actually found any examples in Winchester itself yet. Bird spotters amongst you might be able to recognise some of those, put them on there to give you I think wild birds generally quite rare. The geese, they were probably starting to keep geese domestic as well. Of that lot on there, none of them are really common. This one down here is probably the more common one, is woodcock. But again, we're talking a few bones here and there, certainly not a staple. But in that same pit with the 7 dogs in the news recently, well, that's a wing bone, a humerus of a white-tailed eagle. They were around, and you do start to ask the question: why is this appearing in this pit, along with a raven skeleton? Want to sort of end on looking at chickens. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in this country, for the first time ever, chicken meat surpassed beef as our most common meat. Did you notice that in the news anywhere? Absolutely unbelievable, because chickens weren't even around in this country until around about 500 BC, and then in very small amounts. What we have done to transform this species, which is a Southeast Asian species, native jungle, far off from Southeast Asia, they've gradually spread across Europe. By the time we get to the Roman period, yes, we get them. Now, this is, again, work we did in collaboration with the people at Reading. So this is their sites. Now, what this is, to keep things simple, I'm just comparing the number of chicken bones with the number of sheep bones. If we have loads of cattle bones as well, it gets more complicated. So just looking at 2 species. We know that sheep are quite common, yeah? So on these different sort of, on the rural sites, on the other side, there you have 300 sites. The amount of chicken bones compared to the number of sheep, more often than not, there's none, or less than 1%. Few get up to 1 and 5. Villas, slightly more prestigious, of course. Yes, you get in a few sites. I think that's his Fishbourne right the way over here. No, that's Fishbourne there. You're getting somewhere that it doesn't appear. Chickens are probably quite a high status food in those days. Roadside settlements. Yes, right. So there's there. In towns, that's the one. That was where we had 350 sites. you're much more likely to be eating chicken if you lived in a town. And Winchester is actually not the highest. W stands for the sort of average for in Winchester of this particular, some are larger than that. So there's a big difference. Not that all chickens were eaten. And this is where I always sort of compare chickens with parrots. If you've never seen a chicken and you're just used to the boring brown birds which fly around our countryside, and you come across this noisy, exotic, colourful animal for the first time, it will have an impact. I call it sometimes also the Peacock Effect. Yeah. If you've never seen one, this is really, and that is why in the early phase, we actually do find chickens associated quite often, just complete skeletons, sometimes in graves, sometimes sort of in, there are even temples. In Gloucestershire, there's a temple at Ewley, which is just full of chicken bones, and they seem to be breeding them for that. They're associated with some of the gods, particularly Mercury, and the goddess of dawn, and so on and so forth. So this rare species has a different meaning in different ways. This is right at the beginning of the Roman period, before the Romans got here. They actually, this really rare species, they're putting them on some coins. There's the so-called Chichester cock series, which have got chickens on some of the things they're there. So there are hardly any chicken bones themselves, but they're on the coins. Linked again to some of these sites in France, there's another cluster around the Gloucestershire Somerset area. I had a student working with me in Bournemouth, Mike Fider. We said, right, go and find us everything you can find about chicken objects. He did. And you can see he did find quite a lot. Not all of them, you can't put it's all on location maps, because some of them, you know, they're just found and you don't know exactly where they're from. He found hundreds of them. Again, this is a very rare species going on, but it has meaning beyond a bit of diet. You see them in curious locations, though. They're getting some of that one in the red in the bottom there was in a child's grave in Cirencester, a wonderful bronze and enameled object. So we have, as you say, this the meanings in different ways. That, a lot of that is based on work which we've done a few years back, but the work continues. I am now working on material from other parts of Winchester, which have been excavated some years back, and were examined initially, the bones themselves examined some years back, as is a large, often paper archive, but some is digitized of this material. I've not seen these bones yet, but there's a huge, huge archive of Roman action into the medieval period as well. But if you notice a distribution of where a lot of these sites are, in different locations from where we saw the stuff I was looking at before. So we have the opportunity here to look at different areas and take a note of, because I checked I'm digitizing quite a lot of this. I checked my files this morning to see if there's anything turning up. So from this site, Brook Street, there's, among other things, there's a huge dump of cattle's shoulder bones, scapulae. Again, an evidence for a particular process. And in that case, I think they are salting and smoking the meat in that particular area. Another assemblage there has a big assemblage of cattle head and feet. Remember Exeter? We've got one in Winchester, at least one. Warsaw, I've never found anywhere else, and it seems to be here from that Brook Street site, is a large set of deposits of sheep head and foot bones, and that's actually going to be new. We've not really found that sort of level on sheep before. Southgate Street down here, 75% cattle, femur, tibia, radius, ulna, all split, all with filleting marks. We've got one of those things, those big dumps for marrow processing turning up on here as well. So we're getting that going on there. Some of these central sites have more pig bones than we had on there, on the outskirts. We found, I think, I've yet to find the context, we found one or two more examples of these sheep spit roasted animals put into a particular place. So we're moving on. The other things which we can do, and there the science continues. When all these sites were excavated, of course, we didn't have the suite of possibilities which are now available at cost, admittedly, which we can do today. So provided money can be found, some of the things we can do would be some more of the isotope. Remember we showed that strontium isotopes thing from Osselbury? Really interesting to see if we did something in Winchester and some of the other towns like that. We've done similar things in Exeter and one or two other towns, and starting to see quite a wide range of distribution. We can also look at other stable isotopes such as nitrogen and carbon, because they are good indicators of a diet. They've been used a lot on human remains. They can sort of tell whether you're eating a lot of protein, for example, a lot of fish, and so on. I'm just thinking in terms of pigs. If I've got a theory, and other people have theories that you're keeping pigs in towns, they might be having a different sort of diet to what they would do if they were allowed to sort of forest in the wood and get fattened up in the woodlands. They may have a different sort of diet, which could be reflected in the bones and so on. I mentioned briefly DNA, that is feasible as well. It's been done on animals from other periods. It's perfectly feasible to be done here if you've got the right questions to go with it. Lipid residues and that sort of thing as well. And I'm sure there are other things which we could develop alongside the traditional zooarchaeological work which people like I do. But this is the advantage, of course, and there's a couple of big things, storage things in the museums. People always say, well, why are you keeping all these bones or pots or whatever else? Well, it's because of this. We get advances in science, and if they weren't there, we don't have this resource. We can actually pull back and start looking at questions for things which wasn't possible 20, 30 years ago. So I think it's exciting. When then it's going to take a good 5 years or so to do more of this work, because we're looking at medieval material as well, and there's a whole other things going on in the medieval period, which I even mentioned, and these sort of things. So it's all very exciting, really. I hope it comes across as exciting. Anyway, I will shut up now.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was very enlightening and entertaining talk, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions that people have from that. We're going to take our usual break, and the staff kept the bar open, so do please support them if you can. We'll hopefully take about 10 minutes or so out from there. We do have the return of the sweetie jar, or the thanks to a couple of people who've already donated either through that or through PayPal. Digital money is always nice these days. Don't usually touch it. So if you'd like to contribute to the venue costs, that'd be great. What else was I going to say? So I put some post-it notes if people have got questions they know already they want to write down, but we'll find a way of doing something with those as well. In fact, the other thing I was going to do was put up the, get to the last slide. Right. Yep. There's enough. You can text me questions if you want to. So we will be back in about 10-15 minutes. We're planning for our next talk to be the 2nd of May. We haven't quite worked out all the details yet, so we'll update you on that when we know some more. And we're hoping to build out the new programme and start promoting it through the Cultural Trust. And big thanks to Liz and the team for pulling the stops out to get everything arranged for us. It's the first time they've had to do all this. It's a completely new team in the house, so appreciate their efforts to support us on that. And yeah, we'll be back for questions in about 10 minutes. Okay, so we're now back, and apologies to people on YouTube for not seeing the slides. We're going to try and work that out for the recording somehow, but I did promise you it might not work. So please welcome back Professor Mark Maltley, who has a sheaf of post-it notes with questions on. But I've got one first. You were talking quite early on about eggs.
Yes.
And people that, but chickens were very rare. Do you know what birds they would have had their eggs from?
They were mainly from chickens, in fact. Now, I'm glad you reminded me of that. You remember that thing I talked about, Vindalanda, which had, we want these. Well, why are they writing that down? If they could get them on the doorstep, they would, we want eggs because we ain't got them here. I had a colleague of mine at Bournemouth, as you know, a lecturer at Cardiff, Julia Best, who did a lot of work on eggshells. Now, eggshells are notoriously difficult to deal with, needless to say, because you don't get an omelette without breaking eggs, and we get tiny pieces. It is possible to identify them, but she could do some fantastic things. She could tell by looking at the interior structure of an egg whether the egg was from or had a chick which had hatched, because the structure changed, or was freshly laid. And of course, if you're interested in eating eggs as food, freshly laid is better. And she did a lot of work on that, again, at Fishbourne as well. The nice one was from the amphitheatre up in Chester, where they found some eggshells, which they did identify to chicken, actually on the seats of the amphitheatre. And these were fresh eggs. So there's two reasons for that. Either they were chucking them at the gladiators, or they had a picnic lunch with them. Like, you go to the cricket these days, have your little sandwiches there and what else. So that was chicken. But eggs do survive. It takes a lot of ingenuity to actually identify them, but there are ways we can now do it. But I still think there were the change. It was happening during the Roman period. They were increasingly being kept for food as well, but they still had these other meanings as well. This is the point. As a cultures, we all have our different relationships with animals. Across the world, we have different relationships. Certain cultures will have taboos on eating of certain animals, or indeed animals at all. Our attitudes change and so on. Does that answer that one?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I've never done this before. This is all really quite exciting or worrying. Right, do not darken our plate. No, it doesn't say that. Do you have any findings of ray oysters or other shellfish? It says John and somebody. Was it just John? Anyway, John and Maureen, is it? Yes. You have it, John. That's hello, yes. Yes, we do. And we get a lot more of them. Now, I'm not an expert on oysters. We keep them on archaeological sites. There are other specialists who do oysters, and looking at the shape and size of them, there are, I worked with a lady called Jessica Winder at Southampton when I was there. She could tell after a while whether an oyster came from Poole or Whitstable, which at the time, this is before Strontium, which made me very jealous because I had all these animal bones. I had no idea where they came from, whether they were in the field next door, but she could tell that, and she would also look at the infestations and the barnacles and other things on them, and the worms on them, and do a lot of things. Not a huge amount has advanced in the last few years. I do know that a Winchester unit has thousands of these in boxes, well, lots of them in boxes, which we can get to actually look at. I'm trying to avoid doing them myself, actually. But yes, the answer is that, and we get them beforehand, and you certainly get a lot more on the sites. And what you're getting them on all types of sites, but you're more likely to find them in towns and in villas. Again, probably because of luck. And again, I think about where you're likely to have oysters which aren't going to go off. If you're around the Birmingham area, getting oysters may not be such a good idea compared to somewhere like Winchester or somewhere nearer the coast. So yes, we do. and it's a slightly underused resource. So that's that one. I've had a preview of this one already. An excavation of a Roman villa somewhere in North London. I found a flat Roman tile with the following print on it. There's a little print here. Not quite to, well, is that to scale anyway? It's probably of a dog. So what's someone when they were making the clay and it was drying out, and some pesky dog came up, put its paws on it, and that's there imprinted there. There has been work in Silchester where somebody has actually gone through and looked at all these to see what sort of animals were being on the it's again a thing about our relationship with animals. Dogs, of course, would have been kept around on sites. They weren't eaten generally. We have, which is okay, I suppose. But we have a lot of evidence we generally talk about, because it's one of our problems of gnawed bone. Now, if those of you will have dogs, you know what dogs will do with bones given the chance. Either destroy them totally or nibble on them in particular ways. And nibble on them in actually very predictable ways, actually. When they'll go for the ends of the bones first and leave the shaft. But you get the telltale evidence of dogs without the bone. And that's a bit of a problem for us, of course, because they're more likely to destroy the small animals' bones than the big ones. So we have to take that into account as well, which is, I didn't inflict that type of worry on you today, but trust me. No, I haven't read this one. This is in blue. Oh wow! We have found a lot of animal teeth and split bones in our garden by crowded terrace.
We've also found 5 Roman coins as well.
Here we go.
Because there was a crowded terrace on that map that you showed.
Yeah. If I remember rightly where it is, we're in the west of the town, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. You've just beyond.
Yeah, they've done in the same that volume I showed earlier on. There is a section on which includes crowded terrace and the Roman period in there. And yes, if I recall correctly, it was one of these areas where we had a lot of cow bones and a lot of them split. So you didn't keep them by any chance, did you? You kept them. Oh, okay. Have a word with me afterwards. One thing which happened in my job in the last 2 years, as an aside, is in Bournemouth, because we all were in lockdown, what could we do? Couldn't go out. We all started digging our gardens. And we had, because we work with the police on inquiries, we had, well, we normally probably get about 5 or 6 a year. We've had about 50 inquiries from various police forces saying someone's found some bones in the garden. Can you reassure us they're not human? So yeah, digging in the gardens on these sort of things. So that is certainly an area where there's Roman activity going on. Yes. Probably just down the road from you, not know exactly where you live, but yes, and it does sound as though you've got there. So you have probably evidence. I mean, if I look at the bones, I'll probably be able to say that you've definitely got Roman butchery there. Yeah. I might put a bid on the house. Oh yes, we had a discussion about this. Is to do with the size of the animals, maybe linked to the value of the meat. That there may be. I was sort of hinting this a little bit, that the larger animals might be more attractive for people coming into the town because you get more meat off them. And what I hope I got across is that in terms of the beef, which is the cattle were larger anyway, the same with some of these other animals. So yes, one of the reasons for the contrast is that what I didn't go into because of time is that when we can tell from some bones, that I left this out, you can tell whether you've got male or female animals. So a particular bone of cattle, the metacarpal, where you can tell whether you've got a cow or a male, usually an ox or a bull. A lot of the cows coming into Winchester and other towns actually are cows, as opposed to, which my natural thought was got more likely to be the oxen and bulls. But that's one thing. The other reason, and I think it will link on to what the next thing is that why do you need cattle in the countryside? If you're not using horses for ploughing, you're going to be using cattle. And at Osselbury, they have more male cattle found there in relative terms than they do in the middle of Winchester. So, but those cattle, once they finished, or more of those were finished, didn't go into the, if you look, the Winchester market. They stayed out on the side, possibly because some of them were quite old. So we can actually look at these sort of things as well to do that. As I say, that links into this one, which says, is there evidence of other foods eaten in Rome, Winchester and beyond? Oysters, snails, don't know about the snails, nuts, seeds. In this building in the end of April, they're having a book launch, which is the environmental archaeology of Roman Winchester, where they actually look of Winchester, full stop, just the Roman and into the later periods, where some fantastic experts have actually looked at this material. And yes, we have from different periods lots of evidence for crop processing. And by the time you get to the medieval period in particular, you have these cesspits with, frankly, poo basically coming out. You know, you eat certain things, so you're getting grape pits, apple pits, and all these sort of things, in addition to evidence of crop processing. So yes, we do. And if I'm really honest with you, probably more important than animals and proteins than they're there. But hey, my job is to do animals, so I'm always going to be biased. But yes, whoever that was, there is a lot of evidence for other things, but it's more difficult to get hold of because it doesn't survive as easily as bones. For plants to remain, they've got to be waterlogged or occasionally mineralized, which is when they've gone through the gut, or burnt. And not everything, you know, it's fortuitous if they're burned. Some crop processing activities will parch the things as you get evidence of that, but it's much more difficult to find the evidence. By the time we get to the medieval period, we obviously also look up some of the documentary data for this as well. But, so that's that one. That's all I have on. That's all I have at this end.
One quick one from me. You talked about pigs.
Yes.
Is there much differentiation between domestic and wild pigs at that time to know what you're seeing?
Yes and no. One of the factors of a lot of domestications is that the animals get smaller. So domestic pigs generally are smaller than wild pigs. We do get a few very large examples, and I've noticed from the sites I'm doing at the moment, 1 or 2 notes saying very large, which I suspect in some cases might be wild. You have to get down into the DNA to be thinking, and the challenge, of course, is with pigs is that you've got a domestic pig over here, they go and forage in the woods for acorns. It's a wild boar over here, and frankly, natural things will happen. So you get these hybrids between the wild and domestic. So we'll have aspects to do with that. So the answer is, in theory, size will, to an extent, help us. And as I say, with some of the other techniques which we're getting available, and including if we went down the dietary isotope route, we can probably look at that sort of thing as well. The vast majority, we are pretty sure, are domestic and kept in captivity.
Jeff had a question. Perhaps you could repeat it into the microphone and his answer. Did the Roman period, did it result in significant transfer of better diets and ways of working your way through the seasons and so on? Did it increase significantly in nutrition?
Okay, yes, that's a question about whether during the Roman period there was an increase or better nutrition in evidence. I suppose the answer is depends who you were. There are some people where I think you would have a much more varied diet available than you would in other cases. We move into it, I'm less confident I can know the full answer to this. We start moving into looking at the human remains and looking for evidence of malnutrition and other diseases like that in terms of stature. In terms of The animals, as I say, we have an interest and we see interest in improving the size of the animals. Now, whether that reflected in taste is another matter in terms of nutrition, but we have to actually look at the human remains to do that, which people are doing. I don't know the full answer in detail of that, but certainly it does vary between different, if you're really well off in a villa, you might be like it is anywhere else, more likely to have a better and wider diet. One thing I've done, I haven't done that many things. Did some work reasonably recently on a site in Dorset at Dewlish, which is a Roman villa, not that far from Dorchester. And we have a look at the sites like that, and we do see a bit of a more varied diet. It's not just a lot of cow, some sheep and pig. You're getting some of these wild animals turning up there as well. And from there, actually, in passing, we had got the first definite evidence that they were keeping geese domestically, because there is a way you can tell that whether a bird is in lay. If a bird is in lay and you actually look things like the femur, and not when it's alive, you break open the bone, there is a deposit on the inside of medullary bone, which if you're looking cross-section, it looks like the centre of a crunchy bar. Very distinctive. And that is a telltale sign that hen or that bird is in lay. So we've never seen this before. We found examples at Dewlish of geese with this medullary bone. We also found signs of goslings, very young goose bones, which we never found before. So we've got fairly good evidence that we had, by the later Roman period, on that site, people breeding geese. But generally speaking, I mean, Fishbourne's a hugely exceptional example where we have a wider range of foods being eaten. There are one or two other villa sites where you also get this evidence of broader diets. Now, whether that then are translated into better nutrition is another matter, of course.
Milan, you showed a very interesting slide where the line were going into cities. In the villages, people have done what was left, presumed that the villages had been ruled and would we know what range of animals were in the countryside?
Summarise that again, Mike.
Yes, that's again looking for a contrast between what people eat in the towns compared to the countryside. Excuse me. Yes. If you remember those sort of slides I showed about the relative number of, say, sheep against chicken, you were much more likely to find that. Other thing which you can actually say, well, were they actually keeping animals on the site? One way we can do this is to see if we can find any evidence of newborn animals. Sadly, those of you who are farmers or know farmers will know, without a modern help, something like 20–25% of any animals in a particular cohort or a particular flock in a given year will die of natural causes soon after birth. So if you're starting to get those on the site, it's a pretty good indication that those animals were being bred nearby. On the rural sites, we do find evidence in quite a few. We get lots of very young cattle, sometimes fetal cattle, lots. The present, lots is too strong a term, we'll get there. Same with very young lambs. And so that's one thing. So we can actually say, well, they were breeding these there. In terms of the diet, I think it's less varied, generally speaking, in the rural sites than in the towns. You're getting, as I say, more pork probably being eaten than some of them in some parts of the town. Not everywhere. This is the point I'm trying to make, is that not everyone was the same in these towns. It's very easy to say, well, in the towns they all like this. Or we all live in the towns, we all have different diets. Well, some of you live in the towns, I'm making assumptions there. But you know what I mean? We have a big range of variations. So we're looking at some sort of almost, if you like, false figure on these sort of things. But yes, the other thing I want to emphasize, which I always tell my students when they've got a box of bones and when they're writing things up, never assume that the animal that you've got there was an animal which was bred there. In the vast majority of cases, it's not, because it can be coming in from elsewhere. The other thing which I didn't get onto today, which I should have done, come to think of it, is how do you preserve meat without fridges? So it's salting and smoking. And I mentioned the scapula just at the end. That's evidence of that sort of smoking and processing. And I showed you earlier on that you're not getting a lot of these specialist butcheries in any of these rural sites, the split bones and the thing, apart from the scapula. What we see in some of that, when they're preserved well enough, you get your shoulder blades are triangular. And a sort of blade, if you're hanging them up, you put the blade on a hook and smoke it. And I've got slides where you show there are deposits of these on some sites where you've got dozens of these scapula, which have clearly been processed and then the meat taken from them. But what we found on some of these rural sites, the roadside settlements and others, we find those scapula. Now, either everybody was doing it, or I would like to think more likely is that you have centres where they were doing large-scale processing. We see what they're doing in Winchester with other animals, and those shoulders of beef preserved are the ones that then get traded out. And that's why you find the scapula being traded out to the site, possibly.
Right. I think probably a good point to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Professor Mark Maltby, for bringing us back to life after 2 years. And thanks to you all for being here, and thanks to the staff and the art for accommodating us. Apologies for people who missed out on the slides. We'll try and work out a solution to that. We can definitely get it right next time. It's just I forgot to do one thing on that one, unfortunately. But please again show your appreciation to Mark for a fascinating talk.